Julius Caesar did not become dangerous overnight. His rise was slow, deliberate, and built on a series of decisions that gradually shifted the balance of power in Rome. By the time he returned from his campaigns in Gaul, he was no longer just a successful general. He was a figure who stood above the traditional structures of the Republic, a man whose influence extended far beyond what the Senate could control. Rome had always relied on a fragile system of shared authority, where power was distributed among elected officials and limited by time. Caesar disrupted that system completely. His victories in Gaul had not only expanded Rome's territory, but also transformed his army into something unique. These were not just soldiers following orders. They were men loyal to him personally. They had fought under his command, survived brutal campaigns, and benefited from his leadership. That loyalty made Caesar powerful in a way that no political title could match. When he crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BC, he did more than start a civil war. He broke a fundamental rule of Roman governance. No general was supposed to bring an army into Italy. Caesar did it anyway, fully aware that there was no turning back. The civil war that followed was decisive. Pompey, once his ally, became his opponent. The Senate supported Pompey, believing he represented the Republic. But Caesar moved faster, fought harder, and adapted more effectively. One by one, his enemies fell or fled. Within a short time, he emerged as the dominant force in Rome. And when he entered the city, he did not present himself as a temporary leader restoring order. He began accepting honors that placed him above everyone else. He was named dictator, then dictator again, eventually dictator for life. That title changed everything. Rome had been built on the rejection of kingship. The memory of its last king had shaped its identity for centuries. Power was supposed to be temporary, limited, and accountable. Caesar's position contradicted all of that. Statues were erected in his honor. His image appeared in places where only gods had been represented before. His authority grew so extensive that it became difficult to separate the man from the state itself. To many Romans, this was a sign of greatness. Caesar had brought stability after years of conflict. He had rewarded his soldiers, implemented reforms, and strengthened Rome's position. But to others, especially within the Senate, it was something else entirely. It was a warning. They began to see Caesar not as a leader within the Republic, but as a man who might replace it. And once that idea took hold, it changed everything, because if Caesar continued on this path, the Republic would not simply be weakened. It would disappear. The decision to act against Julius Caesar did not happen suddenly. It developed over time, shaped by fear, political calculation, and a growing belief that the Republic was at risk. The men who would eventually conspire against him were not outsiders or enemies of Rome. They were senators, individuals who had built their identities around the idea of a balanced political system. To them, Caesar's rise was not just unusual, it was dangerous. Gaius Cassius Longinus was one of the first to recognize that traditional opposition would not be enough. Caesar had too much influence, too much support among both the military and the people. Legal challenges, political resistance, and debate within the Senate had lost their effectiveness. The structures designed to limit power were no longer functioning as intended. Cassius understood that if something was going to be done, it would have to be decisive. He began speaking to others, carefully testing their reactions. These were not open discussions. Each conversation carried risk. To oppose Caesar openly was to risk being seen as an enemy of the state. But as more men shared their concerns, a pattern emerged. They were not alone. There were others who felt the same unease, who believed that Caesar's position threatened the foundation of Roman governance. Among them was Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was not an obvious conspirator. He had been shown favor by Caesar. He had benefited from his leadership and had no immediate personal reason to oppose him. But Brutus was deeply connected to the ideals of the Republic. His family history, his education, and his sense of identity were tied to the belief that no single man should hold unchecked power. For him, the issue was not personal loyalty. It was principle. His involvement changed everything. With Brutus, the conspiracy gained legitimacy. It was no longer just a group of dissatisfied senators. It became a movement that could be framed as an act of preservation. They convinced themselves that what they were planning was not murder, but necessity. The plan itself was simple in structure, but complex in execution. Caesar would be killed in the Senate. There would be no army, no public confrontation, no warning. The attack would be sudden, coordinated, and final. Each conspirator would take part, ensuring that responsibility was shared. This was important. It meant that no single individual could be blamed alone. They believed that by acting together, they were protecting Rome. They believed that removing Caesar would restore balance. They believed that once he was gone, the Republic would return. But there was something they failed to consider. Rome had already changed. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BC, Rome did not yet know it was about to change forever. The city moved as it always did, busy, loud, filled with routine. But beneath that normality, tension existed. There had been warnings, rumors, signs that something was not right. A soothsayer had told Caesar to beware the Ides of March. Others close to him had expressed concern. His wife, Calpurnia, reportedly urged him not to attend the Senate session that day. She had seen visions, dreams that suggested danger. For a brief moment, Caesar considered staying away. But that moment passed. He had spent years building an image of confidence, of control, of inevitability. To stay home because of fear, because of rumors or dreams, would contradict everything he represented. And so he made the decision to go. The Senate meeting was not held in the usual location. It took place in the Theatre of Pompey, a temporary setting while the main Senate building was under repair. The symbolism was subtle but important. Pompey had once been Caesar's ally, then his rival. Now, Caesar walked into a building associated with a man he had defeated. Inside, the conspirators were already in position. They did not rush. They did not show urgency. Everything had to appear normal. They approached Caesar gradually, under the pretense of presenting a petition. It was a familiar act, something that would not raise suspicion. Caesar, surrounded by senators as he often was, did not immediately recognize the danger. Then, without warning, the first strike came. It was not fatal. It was confusion. For a split second, Caesar reacted not with fear, but with disbelief. He tried to understand what was happening, to identify the attacker. But before he could respond fully, more blades appeared. The attack became coordinated, rapid, and overwhelming. Each conspirator stepped forward, delivering a blow. It was not a clean execution. It was chaotic, driven by urgency and fear. Caesar attempted to defend himself, but the situation was impossible. He was surrounded, unarmed, and facing multiple attackers at once. This was not a battlefield. There was no strategy to apply, no formation to break. It was close, personal, and immediate. And then, in the middle of that chaos, he saw Brutus. The significance of that moment has been debated for centuries, but its impact is clear. Among all the attackers, Brutus represented something different. Not just another opponent, but someone Caesar had trusted, someone he had not expected to stand against him. Resistance ended quickly after that. Within moments, Caesar collapsed. His body, once the center of power in Rome, lay on the ground of the Senate floor. The attack was over. The conspirators stepped back. The assassination was complete. But what they believed would follow had not yet begun. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, there was a brief moment where the conspirators believed they had succeeded. Caesar was dead. The man they saw as a threat to the Republic had been removed. For them, this was the conclusion of their plan, the decisive act that would restore balance to Rome. Some of them even raised their daggers, still stained with blood, as if expecting recognition for what they had done. But Rome did not respond the way they had imagined. There was no immediate support, no wave of approval from the people. Instead, there was silence. Confusion spread quickly through the city as news of Caesar's death began to circulate. For many citizens, this was not a moment of relief. It was a moment of uncertainty. Caesar had not ruled through fear alone. He had also provided stability, reforms, and opportunities that many had come to depend on. Without him, that stability disappeared instantly. The conspirators had assumed that removing Caesar would automatically restore the Republic. But they had misunderstood the nature of power in Rome. Power was not just held in titles or positions. It existed in relationships, in loyalty, in perception. Caesar's influence did not end with his death. It transformed. Mark Antony understood this better than anyone. He had been close to Caesar, both politically and personally. He had not been part of the conspiracy, and more importantly, he had survived. While the conspirators believed the situation was under control, Antony was already thinking ahead. He recognized that the assassination had created a vacuum, and that vacuum would not remain empty for long. At Caesar's funeral, Antony was given the opportunity to speak. It was a turning point. He did not openly attack the conspirators at first. Instead, he spoke about Caesar, his achievements, his leadership, his relationship with the people of Rome. He reminded them of what they had lost. Slowly, carefully, he shifted the perception of the event. What had been presented as a necessary act began to look like something else, a betrayal. And as that perception spread, the mood in Rome changed. The crowd, once uncertain, became restless, then angry. The conspirators had expected to be seen as defenders of the Republic. Instead, they were increasingly viewed as the men who had killed a leader many respected. Control was slipping, and once it began to slip, it did not stop. The assassination of Julius Caesar did not preserve the Roman Republic. It accelerated its collapse. What the conspirators had believed would be a final act of correction instead created a chain reaction that they could not control. Power, once centralized in Caesar, did not disappear with his death. It fragmented, shifted, and quickly began to reorganize around new figures. Mark Antony did not act alone for long. He soon aligned himself with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, a young man who understood the political landscape with surprising clarity. Along with Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate. This was not a return to the old republic. It was a new concentration of power, supported by military force and driven by a clear objective: eliminate opposition. The conspirators, including Brutus and Cassius, found themselves in a position they had not anticipated. Instead of being celebrated, they were forced to flee Rome. They gathered forces, attempting to defend their actions and preserve what remained of the republican system. But the narrative had already shifted. They were no longer seen as protectors. They were seen as assassins. The conflict that followed was not political debate. It was war. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Philippi. There, the forces of the conspirators faced the combined armies of Antony and Octavian. The outcome was not in their favor. The structure they had hoped to defend no longer had the support it once did. One by one, their resistance collapsed. Cassius fell. Brutus, recognizing that defeat was inevitable, chose to end his own life rather than face capture. With their deaths, the last serious attempt to restore the Republic ended. Rome did not return to its previous system. Instead, it moved forward into something fundamentally different. An empire, ruled not by a senate of equals, but by a single dominant figure. Octavian would eventually become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The transition was complete. The Republic, as it had existed for centuries, was gone, and the irony was impossible to ignore. The men who had killed Caesar believed they were preventing tyranny. In reality, they ensured its arrival. That is the brutal truth behind the betrayal of Julius Caesar. They expected to save Rome. They ended it.